I think business architecture has a problem with assumptions, not because our frameworks don't contain them. They do. The problem is that I rarely see anyone actually treating assumptions as architecture. We tend to record them in design documents, project papers, risk registers, and requirements work, and then move on. But an assumption is much more fundamental than that. An assumption is a statement of perceived truth. It is something the enterprise believes to be true about the world, sufficiently strongly that it is prepared to make decisions and operate its business on that basis. I think of the collection of those beliefs as the enterprise's perceived truth system. And that distinction matters. An assumption isn't a principle. A principle tells us what we believe should be done. An assumption tells us what we believe is true. It isn't a requirement. A requirement tells us what must be achieved. And it isn't a risk. A risk describes an exposure arising from uncertainty. The assumption is part of the belief system from which that exposure can emerge. Take a value retailer serving predominantly lower-income customers. It may operate on the assumption that deferred payment materially increases customer access and sales, while the economics of providing that credit remain viable. That's not a principle. It's not a requirement. It's not a risk. It's a belief about the world. And that belief may sit underneath an enormous amount of business behavior. The retailer may also believe that its customers are highly price sensitive, that raising prices materially would damage demand, that maintaining a particular level of inventory is necessary, that the financing cost of deferred payment can be absorbed within the margin. Now change the world. Interest rates rise, consumer confidence falls, retail bank lending contracts, inventory financing becomes more expensive. The architectural question shouldn't simply be, what's the new risk? It should be, which assumptions about our world have just been challenged? Because those assumptions are part of the perceived truth system that makes the current business model rational. And once an assumption is challenged, everything built upon it may need to be reconsidered. Perhaps deferred credit is no longer economically attractive. Perhaps inventory is now too expensive to carry. Perhaps raising prices is still the wrong response because the customer demographic is too price sensitive. Perhaps the business should promote more pay now transactions, reduce inventory, or promote products with better margins. There isn't necessarily one answer, and that's precisely why I think assumptions deserve much more attention in business architecture. The frameworks already contain the concept. I'm not arguing that somebody forgot to put assumption into a meta model. I'm asking a much more uncomfortable question. How often do we actually architect with our assumptions? How often do we explicitly model what the enterprise believes to be true about its customers, markets, economics, competitors, and operating environment? How often do we understand which parts of the business depend upon those beliefs? Because otherwise we have an architecture describing what the business does, BI telling us what is happening, risk management telling us what might go wrong, principles telling us how we should behave, and requirements telling us what needs to change. But where is the model of what the enterprise believes to be true about the world? That's the question I think business architecture needs to start asking. Because perhaps business architecture shouldn't just model the business we have. Perhaps it needs to model the perceived truth system that makes that business model rational. And then, perhaps most importantly, what happens when the world stops agreeing with it?